3, 2, and 1. Okay, I think we are live. Raiders, Mr. Swanson here again. I'm at Army National Guard drill this week, and I'm making an audio guide for you for your class, The Road to the Civil War. So last time we talked on Monday, before your test, and the topic was Manifest Destiny. You have since reviewed and taken the test, so I hope we did well. And guess what? Got to paddle hard. It's time to move on. We are moving on to Unit 2B, which is the road to the Civil War. We're going to fight the Civil War, and we're going to go into what is the era of Reconstruction. So road to war all the way until Reconstruction. Ready, set, let's go. So your notes for the day says road to the Civil War has a long and winding highway on it. You will be filling out something for each of these, the open-ended notes. Please copy from the slide. As I always say, it doesn't have to be word for word as long as you understand it. It's okay to use abbreviations or shorthand. I've also posted my teaching notes. This is what I'm going to speak off of in the next few minutes. Might be good for you to read those as well. So audio guide, road to the Civil War. Let's go. Now this first slide here, I won't ask you to do a journal, but I want you to consider to yourself, how do you boil a frog? A frog, boil a frog. Who wants to boil a frog? Well, the answer is slowly. You cannot just put the frog into the boiling water. If you did, if the water was already hot and boiling, the frog would jump out. The frog would jump out and escape. But if you gradually raise the temperature and you allow it to happen slowly, before long, the frog is nice and cozy, kind of in a hot tub of sorts, and then it's cooked. Well, this was much like our road to the Civil War. It was a slow boil until as a country we were cooked and war was inevitable. No one single thing brought us to war, but several small things was one step at a time, or I'm going to say we turned up the temperature just a little bit more. Several events turn up the temperature until the water is boiling, we are cooked, and war is inevitable. So that is how you boil a frog, and that is how it fits into our road to the Civil War. A little bit of a reminder slide here. How did we get to where we are? So from Manifest Destiny, we've already discussed that, and there's a couple of other things you'll recognize that we've already discussed. From Manifest Destiny all the way into the election of 1860. These are the events, a variety of terms and small happenings that we're going to talk about, and these are what paves the road to the Civil War. So I'm not going to read each of those. You can see that we will discuss each of those, and just as the image on the screen depicts, it is a long and winding road until, boom, we are at war. So briefly, a review. The Missouri Compromise. Remember, we have already discussed this. It was inside of the Monroe presidency, the year 1820. Missouri applies to be a state, and when it does, there are 11 free and 11 slave states. Okay, so that's a perfect balance in Congress. The free states don't have an advantage. The slave states don't have an advantage. It's just kind of this quiet, untalked about. Slavery is a kind of an issue as long as there's balance in the country. Well, admitting Missouri would have shifted the balance of power to the slave states. So the compromise then is that Maine enters as a free state, Missouri as a slave state at the same time. I gave you the way to remember that as M&M, Missouri and Maine, M&M. And then we also wanted to try to solve this for the future. So the part of the compromise was to draw a line. Remember, Monroe was the president of two lines. We draw a line right at the 36-degree, 30-minute, 3630 is what we call it, line of latitude. North of the line, future territories who apply to become a state will be free. South of the line, future territories who apply to be a state will be a slave. But here's the thing. Here's the analogy, the description for you to think of. It was really just kind of like putting a Band-Aid on the issue, really just delaying the inevitable. So as you walk through the slides, and you should be on Google Slides, open with Google Slides so you can see all the images. You see the frog there, you see the fire, and you can see that the heat is being turned up just one notch more. As the great American philosopher Taylor Swift would say, Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. You say sorry just for show. If you live like that, you live with ghosts. So we're going to consider the Missouri Compromise to be a Band-Aid on a bullet hole and rather ineffective at actually solving the issue of slavery. It moves on to the Second Great Awakening. Now, the second implies a first. We've already talked about the First Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening is a lengthy time period. Okay, it's not just one event, not just 1 year. Really from the 1790s, kind of into the 1860s and onward. It's kind of a second great religious revival in the country, a focus on morality and Christian values. It appeals to all social classes, as Christianity says is available to all, or Scripture says that everyone who comes to Jesus will be saved. So appeals to all social classes. Motivated people to attack a variety of social injustices. And in particular, we're going to talk about the four big movements that the Second Great Awakening takes on. That is temperance, women's suffrage, which means the right to vote, improved public education, and abolition. So temperance is a movement against alcohol. Basically, the idea was alcohol is bad. Alcohol wrecks families. If dad drinks and beats the kids and the wife, that's not good. So I don't know what you think about alcohol or what your family's opinion on alcohol is, but temperance is the idea that you should abstain from alcohol, and that is part of the Second Great Awakening. Women's suffrage, now that's not suffering, okay? They weren't suffering. Suffrage is the right to vote. And women's suffrage means that women should have the right to vote. We're going to talk about this in several different junctures, okay, because it's actually going to be quite a while till women get the right to vote. But the Second Great Awakening starts this conversation. We're going to see leaders like Susan B. Anthony rise up and fight for women to have the right to vote. This is something we're going to talk about all the way until 1919, when women actually get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So not something that's going to be solved just right now. Improved public education, and the key take there is for all. Everyone should have access to public education, all social classes, boys and girls, and even extends into the belief that enslaved Africans should have there's some right to access to education. Now, of course, slave owners are not going to agree with that. Key leader for this movement is Horace Mann, and here's the real take. Let's be honest. This is why you should be in school today. The belief was that we need to have an educated population so that our democracy functions. We need to have educated voters. We need to have intelligent people voting for the leaders of our country, not to mention leading our country. So why does education matter? For our democracy to function. That was the belief. And then I'll focus a little bit more on abolitionism. Abolition, so break that word apart, like we've broken up a lot of words this semester. Break that word apart and you get abolition, or rather break that word apart, you get abolish. Abolition refers to abolishing the practice of slavery. Or you could say an abolitionist is someone who wanted to do away with the practice of slavery. We're going to have several key leaders in the campaign here. Really, it kind of begins about 1830. And in fact, it was modeled after the abolition of slavery in Great Britain. Great Britain actually abolishes slavery decades before we do in America. And those who in America kind of looked across the ocean and said, hey, this is how they attacked the institution of slavery over there. Well, we're going to use the same tactics here. And of course, that's a decades-long battle to actually abolish slavery. That is certainly a part of the road to the Civil War. So just simply put, an abolitionist is a person who opposes slavery. Several key abolitionists whom we'll talk about: Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison. He's a white man who publishes an abolitionist newspaper. The Grimke sisters, there's two of them. They're white women who are writers and speakers for the cause of abolition. So abolitionism, and the picture you see on the screen there, you see there's a variety of them. And really what I would hope for you to look at is the variety of people, okay? Men and women, black and white. We see different ages involved in that picture as well, a whole bunch of different names. So these are some key abolitionists, those who are leading the fight against slavery as we walk ourselves to the Civil War. So that was all a bit of a review, and now we're going to get into some new stuff, and we're going to start with slave rebellions. So slave rebellions also begin to occur around this time, and you got to think that and from a slave owner's perspective, this is going to make them crack down on their slaves all the more, right? If, obviously they're already humans in bondage, they're already subject to punishments of a variety of kind of ways, and they have total loss of freedom. But as slaves rise up and rebel against their white owners, well, the white slave owners are going to crank down on them all the harsher. So the first one we're going to talk about is Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was a black preacher, and he believed that his mission on earth was to free his people from slavery. And he leads a slave rebellion on 4 different Virginia plantations. So here's the first time we see Virginia really take a key place in the road to the Civil War. And we're going to continue to talk about Virginia in a lot of different ways. Across Nat Turner's rebellion. Now, this happens in 1831. So I said, remember early in our class, we were marching towards 1776. This time we're going to be marching towards 1865. That is the end of the Civil War. So we're going to march ourselves towards 1865. That is when slaves are actually freed. Nat Turner's rebellion is in 1831. So just kind of place your brain there. We're about 34 years before slaves are actually freed. In Nat Turner's rebellion, about 60 white people were killed before Nat Turner and his followers were captured. They were tried, they were put on trial, and they were executed for what they did in their rebellion. There's a huge wave of fear and anger over the murder of the primarily white people, and actually a lot of white women and children, and many innocent black people also became victims of the mob violence in the aftermath. So Nat Turner leads his rebellion, and he thinks he's making a statement against slavery, and he certainly is, but there's an impact that kind of leads to a lot of violence against other enslaved Africans, free Africans, and kind of an increase in the harshness of slavery in total. Here's kind of a kicker here. We'll never really know for sure, but at the time, Virginia was kind of on the verge of banning slavery. But at the time of the rebellion, instead of banning slavery, they instead passed a series of laws to strengthen the institution of slavery. So I don't think Nat Turner maybe knew all that. I don't think he went on his rebellion and was like, oh, well, hey, Virginia's about to ban slavery as it is. Let's go mess it up with a rebellion. No, I don't think he knew all of that. As it is, the byproduct of his rebellion is that Virginia actually strengthens the institution of slavery. And other southern states quickly do the same. They follow Virginia's revised slave codes, and they reflect much more strict control. So the repercussions of Nat Turner's rebellion, the consequences of Nat Turner's rebellion are that slaves can no longer be taught to read, carry a gun, hunt, and that's something that a lot of slaves did. They would hunt for their families, they would hunt for their masters. And here's the kicker. Since Nat Turner was a preacher, slaves can no longer preach. Slaves can no longer be a preacher. And in fact, there's a lot of rules about cracking down on them even gathering for church. Because if they gather together and they talk together, they can plan a rebellion. So wide consequences on Nat Turner's rebellion and for slaves in the area for really the next couple of decades. So turning up the heat one more time, right? How do you boil a frog? You turn up the heat slowly. Nat Turner's rebellion starts the heat being turned up. Next one we're going to talk about here, this is sectionalism. So sectionalism is the belief that someone's region is more important than the whole, right? And you can obviously apply this to the South. Southerners believe that their regional identity was more important than their identity as being from one nation or being from America. You have Northern identity, you have Western identity. This is sectionalism. But primarily, there were two sections in the United States, North and South, and each section kind of had their personal biases or the belief that they could do what was best for themselves, for their section. So you got to think, how do we get so sectioned or divided in the first place? Really, from the beginning, our first government was the Articles of Confederation. That's not a union. A confederation speaks to sections, and yeah, we're loosely organized, but each section can do what's best for it. So our very first government was a confederation, kind of reflected the different interests and the different interests and different specialties of each region. Of course, we dive into political parties, which George Washington called factions. So that's another way that we get sectioned. States' rights is something that's going to start to rear its ugly head, and we're going to see states' rights. We've seen the issue already of nullification, as we talked about the Andrew Jackson's nullification crisis. Then, of course, the big one will always be slavery. Slavery is a big way that we were sectioned differently, and you see the acronym there. PEGS, P-E-G-N-S. You can basically break it down into different beliefs in politics, a different type of economy, different geography, and then difference in the opinion of slavery. So politics, economy, geography, slavery, these are the sections that our country was divided into. And I got a map that kind of shows what are those sections. And here we have it. The heat is being turned up one more time. So that frog, he's starting to boil, if you will, right? He's starting to be cooked. All right, next, moving on to the Compromise of 1850. So we got a Band-Aid on the country, remember? But Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. Well, when you rip off that Band-Aid, the Compromise of 1850 basically erases the Missouri Compromise. I mean, didn't we agree to this line so that we wouldn't have an issue with states seeking statehood in the future? Yes, that's why we agreed to this line. Well, the Compromise of 1850 basically does away with that. Because of the huge argument between the North and the South over slavery, we have several new territories who are applying for statehood, and 5 things happen. And they are brought to you by, this Compromise of 1850 is brought to you by Henry Clay. Again, Henry Clay has negotiated several compromises at this time in history. Remember, I said he's one of the most influential not presidents. And on the slide there, you see that he's been a part of the American system. He's been a part of the so-called corrupt bargain with John Quincy Adams, and he's the author of the Missouri Compromise. Well, now we have him compromising in 1850, and I got to think he's probably getting tired of compromising. So the issue of the day was balance of states, slave and free, and in particular, the territories of California and Oregon are applying for statehood. So follow me on this. There's kind of 5 big steps, and here's what they are. You don't need to write all of these down, but you should summarize. First of all, Utah and New Mexico will enter as a state and choose whether it wants to be free or slave. Utah and Mexico get to choose. California enters as a free state. All people in the United States will, excuse me if I'm on notes here, all people in the United States will return runaway slaves to their owners. This is called the Fugitive Slave Act, and this really kind of erases what is a free state, right? If a slave escapes from a southern state into, let's just say, New York, Massachusetts, a free state, but they escape into that state and they have been free, right? They made it to free soil. Well, under the Fugitive Slave Act, essentially slave hunters can track them into a free state, capture them, and take them back. Actually, it doesn't even take a slave hunter. Every citizen is supposed to report on runaway slaves. So if a slave makes his way into Boston, Boston is a free city, and someone sees him or her and knows that they're a slave, they're supposed to tattle on them, supposed to tell the police, hey, that's a slave. I know that's a runaway slave. That's what the Fugitive Slave Act is. Obviously, Southerners would have liked this. They would have seen it as recouping their property. Northerners, especially abolitionists, were like, whoa, what is free states if we have to return all the slaves who escaped anyway? So the Fugitive Slave Act was definitely a big deal. And then number 4, that there would be no more slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, slavery can continue in Washington, D.C., but no more slave trading, buying or selling in Washington, D.C. That is 4 things. If you'll notice on your screen, they are misnumbered. I apologize for that. 4 things that are part of the Compromise of 1850. What we have here again is just another Band-Aid. All right, it is just another kicking the can down the road until eventually we're going to have to go to war to solve the problem. Now, Henry Clay, he may have been satisfied for the time being. He may have felt he negotiated one more compromise, but really all it was just doing that Heisman Trophy thing and stiff-arming the issue down the road about 10 more years. I love the picture here. That's Henry Clay with his hand to his forehead. And he says, ugh, I can't keep doing this forever. The man spent his whole career compromising, and unfortunately, every single compromise just got undid by the next one, and eventually we go to war, and those compromises didn't matter at all. So there you have it. Band-Aids, frog, fire. The heat is being turned up again. Moving on to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now pay attention to each year here, okay? We've just come through the Compromise of 1850. Now we're in 1854, and we're marching towards what will ultimately be 1865, the abolition of slavery at the end of the Civil War. So 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act basically is a vote in Congress that allows each new state to decide whether it'll be slave or free. Missouri Compromise drew a line. Compromise of 1850 and negotiated several different steps related to several new states, California, Nevada, and others, Utah. Kansas-Nebraska Act just says every state can decide for itself. Basically undid everything previous, undid Missouri Compromise, undid the Compromise of 1850, and now we have every state being allowed to decide whether it can be slave or free on its own. It basically repealed both the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. This leads to what is going to become known as Bleeding Kansas, because Kansas is one of these states that is, well, one of these territories that is applying for statehood. Pro-slavery people who are called border ruffians, ruffian means like a tough person, border ruffians are coming in from Missouri, and they want to vote for slavery. Anti-slavery abolitionists in Kansas are called Jayhawkers, and they fight each other. This is also why the University of Kansas is nicknamed the Jayhawks, because anti-slavery abolitionists from their state. So you got the border ruffians, you got the Jayhawkers fighting, casting votes, a lot of people casting more than one ballot, a whole bunch of election fraud, and this is the condition called Bleeding Kansas. Kansas is eventually becomes a anti-slave state, a free state, and will fight in the Civil War as a part of the Union. As of 1854, the slavery status of each state is now determined by popular sovereignty. That's what this creates, the condition of popular sovereignty. What that means is ruled by the people, and you basically know that as voting that we have today, right? Majority wins, but in this case, the majority is determining whether a state will be slave or free. And really, it was a pro-slavery movement, okay? Popular sovereignty. I know it sounds good. It sounds like you get to vote, but what it was at this time was a pro-slavery movement, and popular sovereignty was just going to increase the number of slave states in the country. So does away with the Compromise of 1850, creates Bleeding Kansas, is not exactly democracy because it increases slavery throughout the United States. All right, moving right along to the Dred Scott case, the dreaded Dred Scott case, because this is by far the worst opinion ever rendered by the Supreme Court of the United States, and I'm going to tell you why. It can be known as the Dred Scott case or Sanford versus Scott. Dred Scott case or Sanford versus Scott happens in the year 1857. So Dred Scott, that's a man, that's his name. He's this African-American man you see on the screen there. He was a slave who traveled with his owner to various free states. He lived in the free states of Illinois and Minnesota. So he sues for his freedom. He says, since I lived in free states, I should not have to return to a slave state with my owner. I think they're from Missouri. So as his owner wants to leave these free states, he wants to take his slave with him. And Dred Scott says, I'm in free soil. I'm not going with you. I'm not going back to a slave state. Well, as happens in our country, he sues for his freedom. There's a ruling at a lower court, and it gets all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules against Dred Scott, rules that he is, and here's the impact of the ruling. The ruling basically states that slaves are property, not people. Slaves are property, not citizens. Here's the comparison I like to use in class. Hear me on this. So imagine you've taken a multi-state trip in car. Okay, we're going on a road trip. Let's say we're going to drive to, I don't know, pick a state. We're going to drive to New York City. Okay, from Georgia to New York City. When you drive into South Carolina, when you start your trip in Georgia, is that car yours? The answer is yes. When you drive into South Carolina, is that car still yours? The answer is yes. North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, depending on what route you take, every time you cross a state line, that car is still yours. The Supreme Court is basically saying that Dred Scott is property, and it doesn't matter what line he's crossing, doesn't matter what border he's crossing or what state he's in, he belongs to his owner. Slaves are property, not people. Slaves are property, not citizens. And since they're not citizens, they're not due the rights of citizenship. Slaves are property, not people. This is why it is by far the worst ruling ever to come out of that building, the Supreme Court of the United States. On your screen here, you have the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger B. Taney, who delivered the ruling, and Dred Scott. Another really terrible side of the Dred Scott case is that President Buchanan, the 15th president of the United States, and this is the only time we'll talk about him, he's not even on our president's wall. President Buchanan basically worked with the Supreme Court to make sure that the ruling was going to be slaves are property, not people. And what's terrible about that is that that's two branches of government colluding together, working together. We're supposed to have checks and balances, right? The executive branch is not supposed to influence the legislative branch. But President Buchanan did a little whisper campaign, and he made sure that the Supreme Court was going to vote against Dred Scott, going to vote that slaves were property, not people. And that is what happened. And of course, that is the president getting what he wants, but that's not how our government is supposed to work. So Supreme Court case, Dred Scott case, Sanford versus Scott, terrible ruling. Rules that slaves are property, not people. And this greatly increases tensions between the North and the South. All right, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So John Brown's story starts in 1856. His actual raid is going to be in 1859. Of course, that is walking us very close to the first shots fired of the Civil War. So on your screen here, this is John Brown. John Brown looks pretty clean, pretty well kept. Kind of looks like a Sunday school teacher. Right? It just looks like a good dude. Well, John Brown is a ardent abolitionist, and he decided to fight slavery with violence and killing. He believes he was on a mission from God. He believes he was chosen by God to end slavery, and he brings his sons on board with him, right? They are radical, ardent, violent abolitionists. Abolitionist is against slavery, but throw violence in there and you kind of become a rebel, rebel at least with a cause, right? A rebel with a cause in this case. Brown brings his family members and other abolitionists, and in 1856, this is where his story starts, they attack some pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, and they kill 5 men. This is part of Bleeding Kansas, all right? So they are the anti-slavery Jayhawkers, if you will. They kill 5 men, and they do it in a wild fashion, right? They drag these men out of their beds at nighttime, and in the streets, they kind of like scream at them for saying you're a terrible person for believing in slavery and for owning slaves, and then they killed them, right? They were trying to make their point that they were anti-slavery. Well, Brown leaves Kansas, all right? It was chaotic in Kansas. He was never tried or arrested or held accountable in Kansas. He leaves Kansas, and he decides to begin a slave war in the East. But to do this, he needs to seize some arms and some ammunition. He needs guns and bullets in order to leave slaves in rebellion. He believes that if he has weapons and ammo, the slaves will come to him, right? They will hear of his raid. They will hear of his rebellion. They'll leave their plantations, and he'll build a slave army. He just needs some guns for them. So pick up here in 1859. John Brown leads a group of men, both white and black, in a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Now, this is in modern-day West Virginia. We don't have West Virginia as a state yet, but this is in modern-day West Virginia. His goal was to basically steal enough weapons for this slave rebellion. Now, he was able to get inside the building. He was able to get inside the armory. He was not able to get out, because once inside, the raid or the building was surrounded by the United States military, actually U.S. Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee. Yes, that Robert E. Lee, the future Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Well, at this time, he's United States Colonel Robert E. Lee, and he actually captures John Brown. So eventually, John Brown is convicted of treason against the state of Virginia, and he is executed by hanging. So as you click through the slides here, you see a couple of different pictures, and I haven't stopped to really talk about them. You know, soak it in. Look at the pictures here. You can see some of the drama unfold. This picture right here is just a wild rendering of John Brown. He's come from the Sunday school teacher, right, with the bow tie and the kind of a gentlemanly look in his face. Well, the portrait here, now this is not a photograph, this is a painting. The portrait here makes him look crazed, right? He's got a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other, and there's a tornado in the background, probably representing Kansas. And what's he standing on? Well, he's standing on dead blue, dead gray, the Union and the Confederate. John Brown, crazed. He's a manic man. He's a maniac. That's what this portrait is trying to say of John Brown. Well, go to this next picture here. This portrait is actually called The Last Moments of John Brown, and it kind of shows a very, very different picture of John Brown. This is captured, now it's not a photograph, it's a painting, but this is captured as John Brown is walking towards his site of execution, walking towards the gallows from which he will be hung. And take a close in look at it. Oh, lights. Take a close in look at the picture here, and he looks very grandfatherly. Okay, he does not look crazed as he kind of did in the previous picture, and look really close to who he's interacting with. You see, it's a little black baby, right? John Brown became a savior to African Americans, right? He was hailed as a hero and really a martyr. When you die for a cause, you're called a martyr. So he was hailed as a martyr for his actions. So convicted of treason and executed by the state of Virginia by hanging. At first, a lot of people were horrified by his actions, but eventually many Northerners came to respect what Brown had done, and he was started to be seen as a martyr. And that's kind of a religious figure. If you die for something you believe in, especially if the government executes you, who executed Jesus? The government, right? If the government executes you, the word for that is a martyr. So he becomes a martyr for the abolitionist movement. Southerners, on the other hand, very angered, and they see him very differently. They see him as a terrorist, right? You could use that word, a terrorist. Many in the South viewed Brown as a terrorist killer, a man who sought to incite a slave rebellion that would have led to the slaughter of hundreds of men, women, and children. So they remember Nat Turner, and now they apply that to John Brown, and they said, this guy's crazy. He was just trying to get us all killed. So, however, it goes both directions. Northerners support Brown, and then they made the South anxious and angry. Here's a real powerful quote about John Brown. This comes from the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says of Brown, this is powerful language, "The gallows were as glorious as the cross. And that is to make a comparison to Jesus, right? Jesus died in Christianity as the Savior. He's basically saying John Brown died by hanging, and he kind of has the same status as Jesus when it comes to the abolitionist movement. So clearly the heat being turned up just a little bit more. A couple of interesting facts more about John Brown. So interesting, number one, Harriet Tubman was supposed to join John Brown at Harper's Ferry, but she was sick and missed the raid, and that likely saved her life because she wasn't a part of the raid. Interesting fact number two, John Brown and Frederick Douglass knew each other. We'll talk about Frederick Douglass a little bit more when I get back. They knew each other, and they actually planned the raid together. Now, Frederick Douglass was not a part of the raid, but he did help John Brown plan the raid. An interesting fact number three, also present at the execution of John Brown was future Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. He actually guarded the site of the hanging. And John Wilkes Booth was there, and he is the future assassin of Abraham Lincoln. So a lot of key players in the future Civil War were present at the time that John Brown was executed. So at this point, a war between the North and the South is certainly looking like a very real possibility. All right, one more. Let's wrap it up. One more, we'll wrap it up. The election of 1860. Okay, we got to memorize this one. We don't memorize a lot of dates, but we got to remember the election of 1860. And the big takeaway is this is when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Now, Lincoln only receives 39.8% of the vote. That is not a majority, okay, but it was the largest vote getting for any candidate on the ballot. He was the Northern candidate, and basically he won because the North had more people. And this is definitely a divide between North and South. Northerners voted for the Northern candidate. That was Abraham Lincoln. Southerners voted for several different Southern candidates. And bottom line is Lincoln won. And this sets the stage for sets the stage for division and sets the stage for secession. Okay, that's a word we're going to use a lot in the next week. To secede means to break away from the Union. That's what the Confederate States did. They seceded. See, a lot of Southerners believed that abolition was going to be a foregone conclusion with the election of Lincoln. They believed Lincoln was going to do away with slavery like that. But honestly, perhaps that probably wasn't the case. Lincoln was definitely a Unionist. Okay, he definitely wanted to keep the Union together. Lincoln was against the spread of slavery. His writing and his speaking definitely shows he was against the spread of slavery. But Lincoln was not purely an abolitionist. He was not 100% for doing away with slavery. Some of you are like, wait a second, isn't he the great emancipator? Yes, we'll get there. But Lincoln was not 100% for abolition. So some of these Southerners who thought he was going to do away with slavery right away, probably not the case. He was a Unionist, and he recognized that the country could not exist as two things. The picture you see here now, this is him giving a speech on the campaign trail. And I'll move to this quote right here. A picture of him says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. It'll either become all of one thing or all of the other." A lot of people assumed what he meant by that was he is going to make the country free. What he really meant by that was that slavery is fading away, right? Slavery is most likely going to dissolve in the next couple of decades, and we don't necessarily need to mess with it. A house divided cannot stand against itself. It'll either become all of one thing or all of the other. That was just his statement that we're on the dying edges of slavery. Okay, this is him. I'm not going to do away with it, but I believe it'll fade away naturally. What he was doing there, so we know that Lincoln was a very good speaker. What he's actually doing is quoting Jesus in the Gospels, because Jesus says something very similar, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. I'm going to give you one more Lincoln quote. This isn't on your notes. Here's how I know. Here's how we know Lincoln was not purely an abolitionist. All right, I'm not tweaking with the reputation of Abraham Lincoln here. I'm just reading you some of his own writings. He says this: "If freeing all of the slaves would have saved the Union, I would have done it. If freeing none of the slaves would have saved the Union, I would have done it. If freeing none of the slaves would have..." Let me go backwards. I apologize. Let me reread this quote. "If freeing all of the slaves would have saved the Union, I would have done it. If freeing some of the slaves would have saved the Union, I would have done it. If freeing none of the slaves would have saved the Union, I would have done it." He was in favor of exploring options for the country. He was even in favor of sending slaves to colonize Liberia, Africa. If we free the slaves, maybe we just take them and put them back in Africa, the country called Liberia, which sounds like liberty, by the way. So clearly we have a mixed reputation or mixed understanding of Abraham Lincoln. Was not an abolitionist, was definitely against the expansion of slavery, but to Southerners, they thought he was going to do away with it. And clearly we have our country at a roiling boil. The frog is cooked and the country goes to war over sectionalism, difference in culture, difference in economy, difference in politics, and the big one, issues that divided the nation, slavery. The frog is cooked and the country is going to war. So thank you for your time and attention. That was a little bit shorter than a regular class. What I have hyperlinked here is a video from Prager University, and it's called What Caused the Civil War? It's a short video, just 5 minutes long, and the speaker in the video is an author that I've enjoyed reading. He's a military officer, and he graduated from West Point, so has my respect there. Watch this video from PragerU, and you decide for yourself what you think caused the Civil War. I do have a couple screen grabs from the video, but as you watch the video, you can see these screen grabs displayed as well. So again, thank you for your time and attention. I will leave it to my substitute and Mr. Taylor as to what you do with the rest of the hour. Make sure that your Road to the Civil War notes are entirely filled in. Booklet has been posted as a link. I miss you guys. Appreciate you listening to this audio guide, and I hope you'll learn something more than when you woke up today from room 1206 while on Army drill. Mr. Swanson is out.